In the ancient Egyptian desert, the sun's heat was like a furnace, and the night's cold was razor-sharp. Historians have obsessed over the gold and mysteries of the Pharaohs' pyramids, but the hook of this story lies in a silent, deeper question. How did the common people of a civilization whose primary fuels were desert sand and dry air, and who considered wood fires a luxury, keep themselves warm every single night against the bone-chilling cold? The answer lies in a secret science of architecture grander than any tomb, a house that was itself a furnace without fire.
The air in the Valley of the Kings was a living contradiction. By the zenith of the sun, the golden cliffs of the western mountains radiated a heat so fierce it could melt the very resolve of a man, forcing even the hardened tomb builders into the shade of their temporary shelters. Yet when the sun, the great Ra, dipped behind the horizon, relinquishing the sky to the treacherous dominion of the stars and the moon goddess Aya, the desert transformed. The golden dust turned to cold steel, and the temperature plummeted with the breathtaking, terrifying speed. It was this brutal, nightly metamorphosis that haunted the thoughts of Nebsen, the chief draftsman of Pharaoh Ramses' eternal dwelling. The year was the 23rd of the great pharaoh's reign, a time of unmatched prosperity and monumental construction. Nebsen lived with his family in the village of Deir el-Medina, a tightly packed settlement nestled in a natural bowl of the Theban hills, specifically designed for the elite craftsmen who carved, painted, and stocked the royal tombs. Their village was a small island of order and skill in the overwhelming chaos of the desert. Tonight, however, chaos reigned within Nebsen's chest. He awoke not to the gentle call of his wife, Tadi, but to a shuddering deep in his bones that had nothing to do with fear of the gods. It was the cold, the insidious, penetrating breath of the desert god Seth, who in his wrath snatched the warmth right out of the air. Nebsen lay on his reed mat, which was placed directly on the packed earth floor of the central room. Above him, the ceiling was made of palm logs layered with mud and straw, and above that, a flat roof, currently empty, which was reserved for summer slumber. His house, like all the others in the village, was a rectangular box of sun-baked mud brick, sharing a wall with the house next door, a deliberate design for shared warmth. He reached out an arm, his fingers instantly finding the chill linen of the covering sheet. Linen, the sacred, pure fabric of Kemet, was perfect for the day, but at night, in the deep of winter, it felt like it was woven from frozen moonlight. Beside him, Tadi let out a small, sharp sigh, pulling the light woolen throw, a rare and treasured possession usually reserved for the sick or the elderly, more tightly over their 5-year-old son, Kenamun, who slept nestled between them. The strategy was deliberate, sandwiched the youngest, the most vulnerable, between two adult bodies. "Tadi," he whispered, the sound immediately stolen by the cold air. She didn't stir. She was a woman of exceptional stamina, born of the Nile's fertile edge, but even her deep sleep was fighting the temperature. He could feel the cold radiating up from the floor, despite the thick reed mat. He knew, with the professional certainty of a man who drew architectural plans, that the outside temperature must be hovering near the dew point, only a few degrees above freezing. The desert wasn't just cold, it was dry cold, a vacuum that sucked latent heat from muscle and blood. The question that often puzzled the visiting foreign scribes, the traders from Phoenicia and the emissaries from Mitanni, was not if the Egyptians were cold, but how they endured it without the ubiquitous roaring hearth fires common in the north. The answer was a profound, multi-layered secret, a science perfected over 3 millennia, taught not in papyrus scrolls, but in the very bones of their architecture.
The Fortress of Clay and Silence. Nebsen slid carefully from the mat, careful not to disturb his family. His feet made contact with the mud brick floor, and the initial shock of the chill subsided almost immediately. This was the first secret. Their homes were built with walls that were massive, sometimes a full meter thick, made of unfired, sun-baked mud brick. This material, seemingly so humble, was the genius of Egyptian thermal engineering. During the blazing day, the massive walls absorbed the solar heat, delaying its entry into the interior. When the night came and the outside temperature plunged, the walls acted as an enormous thermal battery, slowly, grudgingly releasing the stored heat back into the small, enclosed rooms. Nebsen walked the few steps to the single, high, slot-like window. He ran his hand over the interior face of the wall next to it. It was cool, but not freezing. A granite block outside would be rimed with cold. This wall felt like cellar stone. The window itself was crucial. It was tiny, high up near the ceiling, and sealed with a lattice of woven reeds. No glass, no intricate shutters. It served primarily for ventilation, but more importantly, it minimized the surface area for radiative heat loss. The small opening was the compromise between air circulation and the preservation of heat. He moved into the adjoining room, the small kitchen area, where a small dome-shaped oven of clay stood cold and silent. This was the second secret and the heart of the enigma: the near-total absence of domestic fires for heat. Fire meant smoke, and smoke meant soot on the white linen, soot on the plastered walls, and soot on the priceless murals of their ancestors' tombs. Furthermore, wood was a precious commodity, scarce and expensive, largely reserved for the smelting of metals, the baking of bread, or the elaborate funerary rituals. To burn wood purely for comfort was an extravagance bordering on sacrilege for most common Egyptians, even the relatively well-paid inhabitants of Deir el-Medina. So the heat had to be passive, captured, and conserved. Nebsen took a deep breath, the cold stinging his nostrils. He needed to activate the final layer of defense, the manipulation of materials and human biology. He walked to a corner and reached into a basket woven from date palm fibers and pulled out a large, smooth river stone about the size of his forearm that had been sitting near the cold oven all day. During the late afternoon, as Toddy baked the evening bread, Nebsen had deliberately placed this stone near the oven. It hadn't touched the fire, but it had absorbed the intense, stored heat of the clay oven's residual temperature. Now, though the oven was cold, the stone held a palpable, dense warmth, a silent, portable sun. He wrapped the stone carefully in a piece of rough, unused linen, a cheaper quality than their sleeping sheets, and carried it back to the main room. The architecture of intimacy. Slipping back onto the mat, Nebsen gently placed the wrapped stone near Kananum's feet, tucking it under the loose wool. The child sighed and curled immediately around the new source of warmth. "What is it?" Toddy's voice was a rough whisper, finally stirred by his movements. "Seth's breath," he replied, using the colloquial term for the sudden cold snap. "I brought the sun back." Toddy instinctively pressed herself tighter against Nebsen's back, a physical maneuver that instantly reduced the exposed surface area of both their bodies to the frigid air. The combined heat of their two large bodies, now sharing a single air pocket beneath the linen, began to create a distinct, localized microclimate. This was the third and most intimate secret: sleeping arrangements designed for maximum biothermal efficiency. They did not use elevated beds in the winter, which allowed cold air to circulate freely beneath them. Instead, they slept directly on the floor mats, the warmest place, next to the thermal battery of the mud brick floor. They slept grouped, often 3 or 4 to a mat, head to toe, or in a tight cluster, minimizing air exchange and maximizing shared body heat. The family was a single, collective furnace. Tadi pulled his arm over her, and he could feel the sudden rush of heat from her skin. "The work tomorrow, Nebsen?" she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. "It waits," he said, thinking of the vast, cold tomb of Ramses, now deep in the earth. The tomb itself was the ultimate example of Egyptian thermal control. Deep within the mountain, the temperature was virtually constant, year-round, shielded from the cruel fluctuations of the surface. They worked in the valley's heat, but the pharaoh rested in the mountain's embrace, insulated for eternity. He looked over Tadi's back toward the doorway that led to the small enclosed courtyard, the only other way to the outside besides the tiny window. This courtyard was another architectural defense. It provided a thermal buffer zone, preventing the night air from sweeping directly into the living spaces. I remembered a conversation I had with an American excavator, centuries from now, named Dr. Harlan Gage, who would eventually visit the ruins of Deir el-Medina in the 1920s of their distant future. Dr. Gage, a man whose mind was clearly baffled by ancient physics, would write in his journal, "The Egyptians were not comfortable by our standards, but they were not fools. They mastered the transfer of heat through mass. They lived in perpetual deep cellars, built of massive clay blocks that breathed heat into them for 12 hours and extracted heat from them for the next 12 hours. They didn't need a central heating system because their house was the system." Nebsen, of course, knew nothing of Dr. Gage and the future, but he understood the principle intuitively. Their survival was a covenant with the sun and the earth. He pulled the linen up over his shoulders and adjusted the simple, curved headrest of ivory beneath his neck. He did not use a soft pillow. Pillows captured and retained heat too aggressively, making the head sweat, which was the fastest way to invite a chill into the neck and chest. The open frame of the headrest allowed cooling ventilation for the head, while the rest of the body was swaddled for warmth. It was a subtle, brilliant balancing act. In the small, packed room, the smell of last night's roasted mutton fat mixed with the sweet, damp scent of fermenting beer and the clean aroma of fresh linen. Outside, the great desert wind, the Kamasin, might be howling, scouring the cliffs, but here, inside the mud-brick fortress, there was only a profound silence and the slow, rhythmic breathing of his family. Nebsen closed his eyes. The stone at Kenanum's feet was transferring its stored thermal energy. The thick walls were gently sighing out the day's solar gift, and his wife's back was a shield against the cold. They were living proof that fire was not necessary for warmth, only knowledge, physics, and family. He drifted back to sleep, warm despite the bitter cold outside, a master of a forgotten science, shielded by the sun's memory, cradled in the arms of the earth. The great American audience, centuries hence, searching for the astonishing secrets of this forgotten civilization, would find their answer not in the gold of the Pharaoh's tomb, but in the simple, brilliant, thick walls of the common man's home.
The master's dilemma, winter's grip, and the vizier's greed. Nebsen had barely found his full measure of sleep when the village trumpeter, Bach, let loose the pre-dawn call. It was a shivering, brassy sound that cut through the mud-brick walls and signaled the start of the day for the sons of the place of truth, the proud, skilled workers of the royal necropolis. Nebsen rose instantly, the heat stone having done its work. Kenneman was now sleeping peacefully, his cheeks rosy. Nebsen left him nestled with Tadi, who whose eyes fluttered open as she heard the clatter of her husband moving the clay water jug. "Go back to sleep, wife. I will prepare the breakfast." He dressed quickly in his simple kilt of coarse linen, the fabric already stiff with the morning chill. Over this, he tied a second, heavier layer, less for fashion and more for insulation against the raw air he was about to face. In the small courtyard, the air was a shock. It felt like liquid ice. Nebsen grabbed a thick blanket of woven straw, a simple, rough hot mat, and draped it over the donkey tethered in the corner. Even the animals required thermal protection. He moved to the small, elevated area in the kitchen that contained the brazier. This was the only concession to indoor fire, and it was a carefully controlled one. Unlike the large, wood-hungry hypocausts of the Romans centuries later, the Egyptian brazier was a small, deep clay pot, a portable heater. He placed only a few small pieces of acacia charcoal and a handful of dung cakes, dried animal dung mixed with straw, into the brazier. He lit it with a few quick puffs from a reed pipe. The charcoal caught slowly, emitting a weak, bluish flame and a minimal amount of acrid smoke, which he immediately directed out the high window. The purpose of this fire was not to heat the room. The tiny, short-lived blaze was far too small for that. Its true purpose was threefold: to bring the morning beer, a thick, nutritious, low-alcohol brew, to a lukewarm temperature, to boil a single clay pot of water for a morning wash, and most importantly, to create a tiny, localized updraft of warm air. This localized heat was the engine for their circulation. As the small plume of warm air rose near the window, it encouraged the cold, denser air to sink, causing a subtle, slow rotation of the air within the massive mud-brick room, which in turn nudged the stored heat from the walls to move inward. As the beer warmed, Nebsen heard a knock on the door, a rapping on the thick wood, which itself was lined with a heavy layer of felted wool to prevent thermal bridging. It was Hori, the chief sculptor, Nebsen's close friend, whose house shared their east wall. Hori was already bundled in a rare thick cloak of goat hair, a garment usually seen only on shepherds who spent their nights on the high plateaus. "Set is angry this morning, Nebsen," Hori grumbled, rubbing his gloved hands, fingerless mittens of linen, together. "He demands more offering than usual," Nebsen agreed, handing Hori a small cup of the still chilly, thick beer. "You look armored, my friend. Is that your vizier purchased wool?" Hori winced. The vizier of the south, Tey, was the pharaoh's second in command and the ultimate authority over the necropolis workers. Tey was also a shrewd, cold-blooded merchant. In a truly cold winter, the demand for wool, imported from the western oases or captured from Libyan campaigns, skyrocketed. "It is," Hori admitted, his voice low, "but at what a cost? Tey has restricted the sale of all high-quality wool and fine goat hair to a single merchant in the western quarter, his cousin, naturally. The price is now 3 times what it was in Akhet, inundation season. He argues it's for the Pharaohs' reserves, but we know the truth. He's cornering the warmth." Nebsen felt a sharp anger. Tey wasn't just hoarding a luxury. He was weaponizing thermal security. For the elderly, the sick, and young children, a good wool blanket could be the difference between life and the embrace of the underworld. "And the common workers?" Nebsen asked, stirring the thin mud paste of the morning bread with water. "They rely on the woven reed insulation and ash pits," Hori said, spitting out a piece of tough reed from his beer. "The vizier's greed is forcing us to rely on the old methods." Hori's casual mention of the old methods was the next layer of the Egyptian secret.
The alchemy of ash, turning waste into warmth.
Hori was referring to a technique perfected centuries ago, born of necessity and knowledge of materials, the insulated sleeping recess. The homes in Deir el-Medina, though uniform in shape, often featured subtle modifications depending on the family's needs and the season. Nebsen's family, due to Tadi's delicate health during the cold months, had a specialized feature built into their main sleeping room. After Hori departed for the quarry office, Nebsen checked on a section of the floor near the wall. It wasn't the hard, packed earth of the rest of the room. This section felt slightly springy, and when he pressed down, he felt a subtle give. This was the thermal cavity. During the annual maintenance before the onset of winter, Nebsen would dig out a shallow pit, about a cubit, 52 centimeters deep, in this section of the floor. This pit was then lined with coarse straw and reed mats. It was not a bed, but a reservoir. Into this reservoir, they would place several layers of material. Old, discarded pieces of woolen felt and linen rags, materials too worn to wear, but excellent for trapping air. Sieving ash. This was the most crucial ingredient. Ash from the bread ovens and braziers was collected and sifted. When packed, wood ash is a highly effective, lightweight insulator. It's essentially microscopic air pockets trapped within a lightweight silicate structure, a perfect, natural aerogel. Date palm fiber waste, husk, the stringy, porous material from date palms and the husks of grain, which was worthless for food or weaving, was piled on top. Nebsen pressed the area again. The combination of the pit, the porous materials, and the ash created a dead air space, a large, thin layer of low-conductivity insulation right beneath their sleeping mat. It stopped the residual cold rising from the Earth's deeper layers and, combined with the heat-releasing mud brick walls, created a small, continuous thermal envelope. It was a system that cost nothing but labor and utilized materials everyone else discarded. It was the poor man's insulation, made necessary by Vizier Tey's rapacious greed. Nebsen knelt beside Tadi. "I am going to the tomb," he said, kissing her forehead. "I will be back before the second meal." "Be careful of the stones. The cold makes them brittle," she warned. "The cold is worst outside, my love," he said, securing his tools. "Inside the mountain, Ra still sleeps." Entering the thermal sanctuary, the tomb of Ramesses. The journey from Deir el-Medina to the Valley of the Kings was short but brutal. As Nebsen walked with Hori and a group of fellow draftsmen and sculptors, the wind, a dry, cutting force, whipped through the narrow canyon entrance. Their breath bloomed in the air like ghostly white flowers, an unusual sight in Kemet, a sign of truly severe cold. They reached the entrance of the tomb they were currently working on, the monumental resting place for Ramesses. The entrance was a sheer, carved door cut into the western cliff face, guarded by heavily bundled soldiers. The moment they passed through the massive, stone-hinged door and stepped into the descending corridor, the atmosphere changed instantly and dramatically. The biting wind vanished. The ghostly white breath stopped. A wave of stable, constant air, neither warm nor cold, but thermally neutral, washed over them. "Ah, the vizier's warmth," Hori sighed, pulling off his goat hair cloak, which now felt stifling. The temperature inside the deep tomb was a year-round, unvarying 75 degrees Fahrenheit, or 24 degrees Celsius. This was the ultimate expression of Egyptian thermal engineering, the Earth's embrace. The stone massif of the mountain, thousands of feet deep, acted as the most perfect thermal sink imaginable. Its depth provided an immense layer of insulation, isolating the air inside the carved chambers from the daily and seasonal temperature fluctuations of the surface. The workers' routine was dictated by this thermal reality. They went into the cold to get to their work, but once inside, they were in a climate-controlled sanctuary. The pharaoh, in his eternal slumber, would never know the cold of the desert night or the unbearable heat of the noonday sun. Nebsen and his team descended into the darkness, lit only by their simple oil lamps, small clay bowls with linen wicks floating in castor or sesame oil. They had to be careful with the heat these lamps produced. In the sealed, constant temperature environment, too many lamps could quickly raise the temperature and foul the air, creating a separate ventilation problem. The tomb was therefore lit conservatively. Nebsen knelt beside Tadi. "I am going to the tomb," he said, kissing her forehead. "I will be back before the second meal." "Be careful of the stones. The cold makes them brittle," she warned. "The cold is worst outside, my love," he said, securing his tools. "Inside the mountain, Ra still sleeps." Embracing the cosmic balance. The Egyptians had a philosophical answer to the desert's cruelty, an answer that mirrored their physical solutions. Tapestry of time. The desert cold, the harshness, the constant struggle, this was the realm of Set, the god of chaos and the foreign lands. The pharaoh, the gods, and the stability of Kemet, this was the realm of Mot, cosmic order. Their mastery of the cold was simply a physical manifestation of this spiritual battle. They did not fight the cold with fire, Set's destructive energy, but with mass and time, Mot's stability. They used the sun's memory, stored in mud bricks, to ward off the night. They used the earth's stability, accessed through deep tombs, to escape the surface chaos. Nebsen dipped his pen, the air still and silent, the walls cool but not cold. He was drawing an eternal journey, but he was also documenting a secret. The most advanced civilization of the ancient world survived the desert cold not by conquering it with force, but by cooperating with physics, one massive mud brick wall, one communal sleeping arrangement, and one well-placed bed of ash at a time. This was a science hidden in plain sight, far more profound than the gold and jewels that captured the gaze of future generations.
The battle for warmth, the vizier's edict, and the people's ingenuity. The morning's work inside the tomb was interrupted not by the call for the midday meal, but by a runner, breathless and frantic, who arrived from the village entrance. The runner, a young apprentice named Iri, carried not a coil of rope or a measure of pigment, but a decree sealed with the Vizier Tey's massive scarab ring. Iri handed a heavy clay tablet to Hori, who was the official foreman. Hori's brow furrowed as he read the crisp hieroglyphic script. "What is it?" Nebsen asked, wiping charcoal dust from his hands. "The vizier's winter edict," Hori spat, his face hardening with anger. "It is a restriction of the people's ingenuity. Tey declares that due to unforeseen resource scarcity and necessary provisioning for Pharaoh's winter campaigns, the construction and maintenance of unauthorized subterranean thermal structures is now strictly forbidden." Nebsen stared. "He means the ash pits and the insulated sleeping recesses?" "Precisely," Hori confirmed. "He claims they undermine the foundations of the homes and are a fire hazard, but we know the truth. He intends to force the villagers to buy his overpriced imported wool and goat hair." The edict was a brutal, economic attack on the very mechanism of the common man's survival. The ash pit and straw insulation were the free, accessible, and highly effective alternative to expensive textiles.
By outlawing them, Tey was asserting a terrifying monopoly over warmth, turning a necessity into a luxury only he controlled. Nebsen looked at the walls of the tomb, the very embodiment of stable, free, and passive thermal control. He seeks to bring the chaos of the desert into our homes, Hori, to conquer Ma'at in the village. The workers muttered among themselves. They were skilled, proud men, but they were bound by the vizier's law. To be caught defying the edict meant a severe beating, forced labor in the scorching quarries, or worse. The choice was clear: freeze slowly at night, or pay Tey's exorbitant prices. Redefining the hearth, passive heat amplification. Nebsen knew they could not openly defy the vizier, but they could re-engineer their survival using only existing legal structures. The key was to enhance the thermal efficiency of their standing architecture without digging new pits. That evening, a profound silence fell over Deir el-Medina. No shovels scraped, no earth was moved. Instead, neighbors gathered in hushed conferences, sharing water, beer, and most importantly, knowledge. Nebsen addressed a small gathering of his trusted neighbors in the center of the dark village. "We cannot dig below the foundation," Nebsen whispered, pointing to the ground. "But the law does not mention external modifications." He outlined his plan, which focused on 3 areas: surface, mass, and airflow. The first challenge was maximizing the minimal heat they were legally allowed to generate, the heat from cooking. The mud brick floor is our battery, but it is often covered by pale sand or light reed mats. We must make it darker to absorb and retain heat better. The next morning, the workers who specialized in paint preparation used their legally permitted pigments, carbon black, iron oxides, and ground hematite, not for the Pharaohs' walls, but for their own. They mixed these dark, earth-based pigments with a thin wash of oil and water, and painted a 2-cubit-wide strip of the floor around where the cooking was done, especially near the oven and the small brazier. A dark surface absorbs heat far more efficiently than a light one. When the women cooked the day's meal, the heat that escaped from the oven, which normally reflected away, was now absorbed by the dark paint and sunk into the mud brick floor, legally storing heat for the night. Furthermore, they gathered the coarsest, darkest date palm fiber mats they could find and placed them over the entire sleeping area. These dark, heavy mats were naturally porous, creating a small beneficial layer of trapped air that provided a legal form of floor insulation. The second, more audacious element involved leveraging the sheer mass of the home. The most thermally efficient part of the Egyptian home was the roof, which was a thick layer of mud and straw over palm logs. It absorbed the full blast of the desert sun and slowly released that heat inward. During the peak heat of the day, Nebsen and his crew began an unusual chore. They hauled heavy, sealed clay amphoras, water pots, up to their roofs. They filled these pots only halfway with water. "Why water, Nebsen?" a neighbor, Senefer, asked, struggling with a pot. "Water has a high specific heat capacity," Nebsen explained, using the common language of Kemet. "It holds heat far better than air or clay. We are building a second thermal battery on the roof. During the day, the roof's heat will sink into that water. At night, that water will release the heat slowly and evenly back into the mud brick roof, which in turn radiates heat downward." It was a brilliant, passive system. The pots, being legally used to store water, were not unauthorized structures. They were simply thermal regulators, harnessing the high thermal inertia of a liquid. The final piece was the management of air. In the summer, the tiny high window created a convective draft, drawing hot air out and cooler air from the ground-level courtyard. This was the summer strategy: ventilate and cool. In the winter, this had to be reversed. Nebsen noticed that the vizier's decree was silent on the use of external shades or coverings. Using old boat sails and thick pieces of scrap leather, materials legally used for transport, the villagers began to seal and cover their courtyard entrances and high windows at dusk. They hung the sailcloth over the courtyard entrance, creating a second, thick air barrier to stop drafts. They stuffed thick scraps of leather and textile into the tiny windows. The goal was to make the house as airtight as possible, trapping the precious, passively generated heat. This air management strategy was called holding the breath of Ra. By minimizing the exchange of air, they maximized the retention of heat.
The Vizier's inspection. 3 days later, the Vizier Tey arrived at Deir el-Medina with a contingent of guards. He was a tall, imposing man, wrapped in a sumptuous layered cloak of foreign wool, looking like an overstuffed vulture surveying his prey. He swept into the village, his entourage noting the lack of illegal digging. But they were immediately struck by the odd changes: the dark painted floors, the oddly arranged pottery on the roofs, and the heavily draped entrances. Tey stopped in the home of Nebsen, the known leader of the draftsmen. "Chief Draftsman," Tey's voice was sharp, "I see no new pits. I see compliance." He surveyed the room, his eyes lingering on the dark floor. "But I see paint. Paint for Pharaohs' walls, used on your common floor. You defile sacred materials for comfort." "My Lord Vizier," Nebsen replied, bowing low, "the paint is old. It is the waste material from a previous season's work, deemed unsuitable for Pharaoh's Ka. We use it to seal the floor against dust, a necessary sanitary measure. The law does not forbid sanitation." Tey scoffed and pointed to the heavy amphorae on the roof. "And this, a reservoir of water. Why not place it in the shade, like all sensible people, to keep it cool?" "The water is placed there to remain pure," Nebsen lied smoothly, using the legal loophole. "The sun's energy keeps the water from stagnating, my lord. We are simply following the advice of the temple physicians, who warn of the dangers of still, cool water in the winter. It is a health measure, not a heat measure. The law does not forbid the maintenance of health." Tey's face was a mask of cold fury. He was cornered. Every modification Nebsen and the community had made was based on existing Egyptian law and material use, cleverly repurposed for thermal gain. They had achieved the warmth of the forbidden ash pit, but without breaking the edict. The vizier could not fine or punish a village for keeping its floor clean or its water pure. He had sought to force them into a capitalist transaction, but they had responded with a scientific, community-based solution. That night, as the temperature plummeted outside, Nebsen lay beside Tadi and Kanamun. The dark floor radiated a subtle heat absorbed from the day's cooking fire. The thermal water pots in the roof slowly released their stored solar energy, bathing the thick mud brick ceiling in a constant low-level warmth. They were warm, not with the artificial, stolen warmth of imported wool, but with the honest, reclaimed warmth of the sun and the earth. Nebsen smiled in the darkness. The ancient Egyptians, facing the most extreme temperature swings on the planet, had mastered the cold not through fire, but through knowledge of mass, color, density, and flow. They had proven that the true strength of Kemet lay not in the gold of the Pharaoh's coffers, but in the ingenuity and unbreakable spirit of its people. The desert could take their fire, but it could never take take their physics.
The Reckoning, the Winter of Tey's Folly. The Vizier Tey left Deir el-Medina in a sputtering rage. His power was absolute, his will was law, yet the common workers, through clever, informed obedience, had made a mockery of his economic tyranny. He was forced to retreat, knowing that the spirit of the sons of the place of truth had won a silent victory. The winter deepened, becoming known throughout the Theban region as the Winter of the White Breath, for the unusual length of time that condensation lingered in the air. This period became the ultimate real-world test for Nebsen's communal thermal strategy. The physics of the everyday, maximizing solar debt. The success of the village now rested entirely on the accumulated thermal debt owed by the sun to the mud brick. Each action Nebsen's community took became a precise exercise in applied thermal physics. 1. The hot rock reservoir, the Amen-Ra stones. The practice of heating river stones near the oven was expanded. Specialized, dense basalt stones, known for their high density and thermal mass, were collected. These stones were placed in a solar collector built in the sunny courtyard, a simple, shallow pit lined with dark painted clay. The sun baked the stones all day. They were then wrapped in straw and linen and carried indoors at dusk, replacing the single stone Nebsen had used earlier. Each family now utilized a rotating set of 4 stones, maximizing the conductive heat transfer to their sleeping mats. This process cost only labor and became a daily ritual of reverence for the sun god. 2. The double-walled water skin, high-beat barrier. The vizier's decree had forced them to seal their windows and doors, minimizing drafts. Nebsen, however, knew that some ventilation was essential to prevent a buildup of stale air and humidity, which ironically felt colder. He introduced a new legal solution, the double-walled water skin. Every family owned large goatskin water bags. Nebsen instructed them to hang 2 of these, partially filled with water, near the window aperture, leaving a gap of a hand's breadth between them. The 2 layers of water-filled skin, though not structurally part of the house, created a small, trapped air cavity, a liquid thermal barrier. The high thermal mass of the water stabilized the air in the gap, and the water slowly radiated the temperature of the internal room back into the immediate airspace of the window, effectively legalizing a cavity wall without digging. The system was named the Hayabit barrier, protecting the house's warmth. 3. The humidification effect, the Sema process. The desert cold was a dry cold. Low humidity accelerates evaporative cooling from the skin and sinuses, making the cold feel harsher. Tadi, observing how quickly the dark floor dried after washing, suggested a solution that was entirely based on domestic routine. They began to deliberately leave residual water in shallow clay basins on the dark-painted, warm floor before bed. As the mud brick slowly released its heat, the water slowly evaporated. This passive humidification slightly raised the moisture content of the indoor air, which felt warmer, and reduced the feeling of chill, mitigating the harshness of the dry desert air. This was entirely a function of domestic cleaning, a legal activity. The trade collapse, Tey's downfall. As the winter of the White Breath peaked, an unexpected economic crisis hit Thebes, centered squarely on Vizier Tey. Tey had invested a monumental fortune, diverting state resources to import thousands of yards of expensive, high-quality sheep's wool from the newly conquered Nubian territories and Phoenician traders, all destined for his cousin's monopoly.
He had calculated that the outlawing of the traditional heating methods would create a desperate captive market. But the desperate market never materialized. The villagers of Deir el-Medina were poor, but they were not foolish. They had been priced out of Tey's market and, through Nebsen's leadership, had simply circumvented the need for his product entirely. The combined effect of the thick mud brick mass, the solar-heated stones, the dark floors, the airtight ceiling, and the water skin barriers was enough to raise the internal temperature of their homes by a crucial 8 to 10 degrees Celsius, 14.4 to 18 degrees Fahrenheit above the outside air, making the difference between shivering and comfortable sleep. Tey's warehouses, stretching along the Nile's western bank, became monuments to his greed. The piles of wool sat unsold, slowly being ravaged by beetles and damp, representing millions of deben, an ancient Egyptian weight unit often of copper or silver, of frozen capital. The merchants who had loaned Tey the funds began to demand repayment. The pharaoh, concerned with the lack of revenue and the sudden disappearance of the promised deben from the wool taxes, ordered an investigation. The chief scribe, a man known for his integrity, visited Deir el-Medina. He found the village quiet, the air thick with the smell of drying reeds and warm grain, not smoke. He found the children healthy, not suffering from the lung-clogging coughs of families reliant on open fires. When he asked a common worker, a stone polisher named Panamun, why he had not bought the vizier's wool, Panamun simply pointed to his dwelling. "My home is my blanket, scribe. The sun pays the tax, not my purse. We warm ourselves with the memory of Ra's light."
The resolution, the triumph of Mut. The final reckoning came at the start of Shemu, harvest season, when the warmth began to return naturally. Vizier Tey was arrested, stripped of his titles not for corruption, but for gross financial incompetence, for failing to anticipate the ingenuity of his own people and leaving the state vulnerable to debt. Nebsen was not celebrated as a revolutionary, for he had broken no law. He was simply recognized as a master of Mut, one who had preserved cosmic and social order through applied knowledge. His greatest contribution was not a drawing on a tomb wall, but the codification of the community's passive heating techniques. Nebsen compiled a simple, illustrated guide on linen scraps, a kind of ancient Egyptian homeowner's thermal manual, detailing the use of mass, dark surfaces, trapped air, and the thermal inertia of water. It was quietly circulated among the sons of the place of truth and became the standardized, unwritten architecture of the working class for generations to come. The astonishment for the modern American audience, centuries removed, is the realization that this civilization, often viewed through the lens of divine power and immense wealth, solved one of the planet's most persistent physical problems: thermal regulation in an extreme environment, not with energy-hungry consumption, but with elegant, sustainable, and community-based physics. They didn't need a furnace because their house was the furnace. They didn't need a textile monopoly because their knowledge was their armor. In the eternal cycle of the desert, where fire was fleeting and wood was scarce, the ancient Egyptians did not conquer the cold. They simply waited it out, enveloped in the quiet, enduring scientific embrace of their thick, beautiful mud brick homes. Nebsen, the chief draftsman, died an old man, respected and warm. He had ensured that the ancient wisdom of his people, the wisdom that mass is heat, darkness is storage, and community is insulation, would survive the cold of the desert night and the cold greed of man for another 3,000 years. His true legacy was the pervasive, silent warmth felt by every family, every winter, in the small, ingenious, and astonishingly resilient village of Deir el-Medina.